I'm Scott Lucas. This is EA's Worldview on Syria. Today, hearts, minds, and Media Mujahideen. I wanted to talk to you today about two themes that are becoming increasingly important in EA's coverage, and I think will become even more important in the weeks and months to come. The first of those themes is the battle for hearts and minds, what some people might call soft power. And the second is the way that this battle is being presented to us, not through official mainstream news agencies, newspapers, television channels, but through a group of people we call Media Mujahideen. Effectively, PR people who have sprung up for the regime, for the insurgents, but not just one insurgent group, many different insurgent groups, from Jabhat al-Nusra, the Islamist group, to the Islamic State of Iraq, to elements of the Free Syrian Army. So why are these so important? First, the battle for hearts and minds. It's noticeable that as the military stalemate continues, that groups are trying more and more to convince us that they are winning by what they are doing for the civilians affected for the conflict. For example, almost every day on its state news media, the Syrian regime will talk about delivering food, providing electricity, keeping services going despite the attempts of terrorists to disrupt them. Conversely, you'll see the US government or the British government talk about how they're supporting reconstruction efforts by the moderate insurgents, providing aid, for example, for food in the city of Aleppo, or providing, for example, for projects for communities in the north of Syria. And then you'll see groups that are supposedly terrorist or bad groups. For example, Jabhat al-Nusra, the Islamist group, who are producing 20 to 30-minute videos of villages that they have gone in, taken over, or have come in with other brigades to rule, and how they are providing electricity, food, repairing roads, helping rebuild schools. And not just Jabhat al-Nusra, but even the Islamic State of Iraq, misleadingly called al-Qaeda's group in Syria. That scare label hides the fact that the Islamic State of Iraq has produced video after video showing them not damaging cities, wiping out civilians, but helping civilians shelter, helping them find food after conflict has ended, even to the point of holding parties during Ramadan, including tugs of war, Quran recitals, and cream eating contests. Why is this important? Because the battle in Syria is unlikely to be won nationally. It will not be some great fall of Damascus or even of Aleppo, but instead what we are to see in the months to come is the attempt by insurgents to move city by city, sometimes town by town and village by village across the country, and the regime trying to hold them back. And the fact is that even if you defeat the other guy's snipers, his infantry, his tanks on the battlefield, you still have the question of winning over the civilians so that you don't have to keep fighting the battle day after day after day against an angry population. And that leads me to the second point. Because it's not just a question of winning over that population, it's telling the world that you're winning that population. Quite often we're conditioned to think that this battle is fought, for example, by a state news media, in the case of Syria, say, Sana, versus, say, other news media, say Al Jazeera or CNN or the New York Times, who give a different story. But in fact, in this decade of YouTube, of Facebook, of quick releases from civilian journalists, citizen journalists, what we are actually finding is that we have Media Mujahideen. People who come out within minutes of an event occurring and saying for the record, this is why our side is helping people rather than hurting them. Examples? Citizen journalists early in the conflict recorded the bombing, the shelling of cities like Homs, like Aleppo by the regime. Some of those brave citizen journalists died in the effort. But last year we noticed a different kind of journalist. For example, a man named Abu Jamal, nicknamed Abu Shouty by EA staff because he never actually spoke to camera. He shouted. He shouted about a brigade with the Free Syrian Army called the Yarmouk Martyrs Brigade. He shouted about the weapons they had obtained. He shouted about the battles they'd won. He even shouted, embarrassingly for the West, about the UN peacekeepers that they briefly took hostage. But the Media Mujahideen weren't just talking about military efforts. Consider, for example, the Media Mujahideen who work with Jabhat al-Nusra, the Islamist group. Quite often, Jabhat al-Nusra's very well-produced videos are not about fighting or conflict, even though you'll see scenes of battle. Instead, the bulk of the documentaries, and that's what they are, is documentaries, will talk about Jabhat al-Nusra working with the population, going in for a new Syria, a better Syria, a Syria that is far removed from the al-Qaeda label that has often been slapped on the group. The Islamic State of Iraq has its own Media Mujahideen, for example, recording those Ramadan parties that they have been holding in Aleppo, and then featuring scenes of the populace embracing rather than rejecting these supposed foreign troops. Why do I emphasize the Media Mujahideen? Because as a starting point for EA's coverage, let me say this to you. If there is a war that the so-called West is losing in Syria, and by that I mean the US, the Europeans, some Arab states, the war that it's losing is not necessarily the one being determined as to whether or not it arms insurgents with heavy weapons. It is losing the battle with Syrians themselves, refugees, displaced persons, civilians. One story about that failure. Last month, a different type of Media Mujahideen, a State Department spokesman, produced a press release. He gave it to a very good journalist in the United States and said, look at all we are doing working with the opposition Syrian National Coalition to give food to the people of Aleppo. Look at the fact that we are feeding 200,000 people a day. Look at the millions of dollars we are spending. Surely this is an example of how the U.S. is helping reconstruction and winning hearts and minds. The only problem? We've gone through weeks, months of video, eyewitness reports, Facebook entries about what is happening in Aleppo, and we can find no record of anyone paying tribute to the United States or to the opposition Syrian National Coalition for these food shipments. Instead, it is the other groups in Aleppo, the other extremist brigades, the other brigades outside the Free Syrian Army that have actually been able to put themselves forward as helping civilians. You don't win a war in the end necessarily by defeating the other guy in the battlefield. You win it in the towns, cities, and villages. And it is that combination of hearts and minds and the way that we see those hearts and minds as presented by the Media Mujahideen that we'll be looking at over the next weeks and months. I'm Scott Lucas, and this has been EA's Worldview on Syria.